In May 2019, one of Magic the Gathering's most anticipated sets of all time was released. War of the Spark. The excitement for this set cannot be overstated. Wizards of the Coast went all out promoting it. There was an incredibly artsy animated trailer, complete with Linkin Park music, which I won't be playing in this video, as I'm only a new channel and I don't want to be hit with a copyright strike already. It was announced that there would be a planeswalker card in every pack, which riled people up even further. And when it was released, sure enough, people loved it. I was at the Grand Prix, or rather the Magic Fest, in London when the set came out, and I've never seen a convention centre full of Magic players more excited to try out new cards. And justifiably so. War of the Spark marked the end of a long-running arc in Magic's story, which had been unfolding since the release of Kaladesh in 2016, and we were going out with a dramatic climax. The set described a decisive showdown. On the one side, the Dragon God, Nicol Bolas, his servants, and his army of metal-plated zombie minions. On the other, the citizens of Ravnica, one of the game's most popular planes, as well as almost every planeswalker ever printed. Sorry, Garak and Mu Yangling. This was an epic story, and Wizards deserved the highest praise for building it up and then executing it so well, at least in card game form. The analogy's been made before, and I'm sure it'll be made again. War of the Spark was the Avengers Endgame of Magic the Gathering. After several months had passed, however, feelings towards War of the Spark had soured. Though people still appreciated how it brought the Bolas arc to a dramatic conclusion, people were less fond of it as a limited format. There are still people who love it, and it's still popular whenever the option becomes available to draft it on Arena, but some people rather strongly dislike it. And there's a third camp, myself included, who are just a bit ambivalent about the set. In this video, we'll talk about what War of the Spark did right and what it did wrong as a limited format. Probably the most common complaint that's raised against War of the Spark is that its bomb rares are simply too explosive. The God Eternals, and Ilhag, are often cited as the primary example of this. Oketra, for instance, not only has great stats for her cost, but is also able to rapidly churn out 4/4 zombie tokens with Vigilance each time you play a creature. But what makes the God Eternals most infamous, however, isn't their high power level, but rather how incredibly difficult they are to remove. Whenever they die, or get exiled, the God Eternals simply slot themselves back into their owner's library third from the top, ready to return to the fray in a handful of turns. There are only two ways to reliably and permanently get rid of the God Eternals. Using a counterspell, of which there were few in this format, or using a mill card, like, ironically, Enter the God Eternals, which dumps them from the top of the library, where they go wherever they die, into the graveyard. The God Eternals weren't the only dangerous bombs in the format. In a draft, Ugin the Ineffable is essentially an automatic pick, no matter which pack he's opened in. A colourless card, capable of filling the board with 2/2 creatures, whilst providing admittedly delayed card advantage and acting as a conditional removal spell. Ugin was both an incredibly versatile and absurdly easy card to slot into any deck due to not having a colour. Nisa, who shakes the world, is also considered problematic by some, as she's capable of flooding the board with hasty and vigilant free-frees, which quickly spiral out of control. Limited formats in Magic are sometimes defined as either Prince formats, which are characterised by the power of their rare and mythic rare cards, or Pauper formats, which are characterised by the power of their commons and uncommons. Luis Scott Vargas, one of Magic's most famous pro players, famously declared War of the Spark to be a king format, arguing that the rares of War of the Spark were so pushed that they left the commons and the uncommons in the dust. Although he later went back on this argument, stating ultimately that he felt the entire format simply had a very high power level, spread across every rarity, his claim that War is a king format still resonates with some players. But just how problematic are the format's rares, compared to those you might find in other sets? We've discussed the set's most troublesome cards above, but how do they compare to the most powerful rares in other sets? Although the format is just beginning to take shape, Kiora Best's the Sea God is already being described as the chief threat to watch out for in Feros Beyond Death Limited for the sheer amount of value it brings to the table. Over the course of 3 turns, you get a giant 8/8 hexproof bomb, the ability to sweep in with that monster unblocked, and then you get to steal your opponent's best creature. Although the card is balanced out by a high cost of 7 mana, unless it's countered or destroyed before it can fully resolve, it's hard for anyone facing down this card to pull off a win. To look at some older formats, if you're playing, for example, the original Feros Limited, and Elspeth Sun's Champion or Abhorrent Overlord hit the field, then the player who played them is probably going to win. All of this is to demonstrate that Crazy Bomb, Mythics and Rares are a feature of all limited formats, and not unique to War of the Spark. The removal suite available in War of the Spark, at common and uncommon, is also significantly better than that available in several prior formats, so when big threats like Nisa or Ugin hit the field, it's more easy to deal with them without necessarily needing powerful bombs of your own. Overall, This leaves the God Eternals as the only major power level problem in War of the Spark Limited, as all of the removal in the world can only hold them temporarily at bay, and there's a cycle of them. Well, of them and their boar friend, meaning you're 5 times more likely to be troubled by them than you are by Curabest's the Sea God, or by Elspeth. The most memorable thing about War of the Spark, though, is the fact that players receive a planeswalker in every pack they open. This is a conceptually fantastic idea, and definitely makes the format unique compared to every other draftable set. In practice, however, this idea had both great pros and cons. The greatest advantage of this system was that it simply makes opening war packs exciting. Even if you're much more likely to open a Dovin Hand of Control than a Liliana Dreadhorde General, the knowledge that there's always a planeswalker waiting in your pack makes cracking open boosters exciting. It also excellently conveys the set's story, and the notion that an all-out war is being waged on Ravnica between Bolas and the universe's other planeswalkers. The presence of so many planeswalkers on the board also makes attacking and casting burn spells a far more involved process. When playing War of the Spark Limited, it's not enough to simply turn all of your creatures right in a headlong charge at your opponent's face. You need to direct some of them towards their planeswalkers, and maybe hold some back to defend your own. This adds complexity, and makes games of war incredibly complex, which is great. At least, usually. As every planeswalker printed in War of the Spark had a passive ability, board states with many planeswalkers out could quickly become quite hard to process. This leads to players at all levels of play forgetting about the passive effects on some planeswalkers. For example, imagine you have Kasmina Enigmatic Mentor in play, and your opponent controls a Narset Parter of Veils. You activate her ability and draw a card and then discard a card, right? Except you don't, because Narset prevents you from drawing a card. Now imagine you control a Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord, and your opponent controls a Tybalt Rakish Instigator. You activate Sorin's ability and ping your opponent for 1 damage. This also heals you for 1, as Sorin's ability grants him lifelink, right? Nope, because your opponent's Tybalt prevents you from gaining life. So you try to use your Davriel to try and make them discard a card, except you can't, because they have Tamiyo in play, who prevents discard. Now, in a vacuum, all of this might not sound so complex, but all these interactions aren't just happening in an empty vacuum. They're happening in the middle of a game, with a constantly transforming board state. So it's only natural that you might forget some of the interactions between your planeswalkers and their planeswalkers, given that they have unique, and, as in these examples, sometimes contradictory effects. Overall, at least in my personal opinion, I feel that this planeswalker in every pack concept was a great idea. I'm glad it was tried, and I feel it's a distinctive thing which makes War of the Spark a unique limited format. But I do feel that, in the event of a War of the Spark 2, or another format incorporating planeswalkers, they'd need to learn some lessons from the experiment they've conducted here. Wizards could either ensure that these passive abilities don't overlap with one another quite as frequently, or else find an alternative way of executing uncommon rarity planeswalkers en masse, which doesn't require passive effects. War of the Spark is both criticised and praised for its slow pace. The board often fills up with creatures and planeswalkers, and players often need to wait until they draw an answer to break through the entrenched board state. This was either tense, exciting, and skill testing, or tedious, depending on who you ask. As previously mentioned, the frequency of planeswalkers who present alternate targets for attacks slows the pace of gameplay. This is compounded by the general slow building up strategies employed by many of the set's mechanics. Both Proliferate and Amass, the set's marquee mechanics, relied on building up a group of initially small creatures into a mighty force, so most games of War of the Spark were slow paced, but whether this is a good thing or a bad thing depends largely on your own personal preferences. Another noteworthy aspect of War of the Spark is its draft archetypes. Personally, these are one of my favourite things about the format, and I feel there are several creative ways to draft the set. The new Amass mechanic is spread across red, blue and black, the same 3 colours that are associated with Bolas himself, in a neat bit of design, whilst Proliferate is spread across white, green and blue. Proliferate had previously been used in Scars of Mirrodin to spread -1/-1 counters around and tear things down, so making use of it here to build things up, whether through spreading +1/+1 counters, or through adding more loyalty counters to the set's many planeswalkers, offered a new angle to explore an old mechanic through in Limited. White and green Proliferate decks would tend to focus on going wide, whilst blue and green Proliferate decks would usually focus on growing either a single creature or a smaller group of creatures into giant threats. Amass, meanwhile, can be approached in 2 different ways, either by building a red and black deck, which was themed around sacrificing the army token generated for Amass several times in order to gain beneficial effects, or by building a blue and black deck, which was themed around building the amassed army up so that it was as large as possible, whilst also buffing it by granting it abilities through cards such as Gleaming Overseer and Eternal Skylord. Of course, Proliferate and Amass are far from the set's only themes. Red and blue Instants and Sorcery Matters decks are a tried and tested theme for the colour pair, though the presence of cards such as Spellgorge Your Weird and Invade the City demonstrate that creature combat would also be a feature of these spell-heavy decks in War of the Spark Limited. Green and Black, whilst perhaps not the most developed archetype in the format, had Leyline Prowler and Death Sprout as their two signpost uncommons, both of which were powerful cards in their own right, and pulled you towards splashing other colours to build over a strong green and black shell. Green and Red had a Power 4 or greater matters theme, whilst White and Blue had a fairly typical control theme. White and Black didn't really have a unifying theme. Cruel Celebrant is a Sacrifice Matters card, whilst Sorin and Oath of Kaya both help with life gain, and Oath of Kaya is valuable in decks that contain many planeswalkers. The colour pair had some of the format's best removal, however, so perhaps this made the colour pair viable in lieu of really needing any synergies to bind it together. Not every one of these draft archetypes was always effective, but they were fairly universally fun. White and green proliferate decks wouldn't always go off, for example, but when they did, it was a blast. Additionally, red and white, typically the aggro colour pair, struggled in the slow-paced format which War of the Spark provided, unless you were fortunate enough to open Feather the Redeemed and 10th District Legionnaire, in which case you could build an incredibly fun combat trick-focused deck, similar to the Feather decks which are often played in Commander, taking advantage of the fact that nobody aside from you will be placing high priority on drafting cards which enabled Feather, such as Defiant Strike, Samut's Sprint, and Nahiri's Stoneblades. The archetypes, at least in my subjective opinion, were one of the more fun aspects of the format, and are a positive note to end our analysis on here as we draw towards the conclusion. So to summarise, War of the Spark was released to initial incredible excitement, justified by it being the conclusion to an epic 3-year-long story arc. Though narratively, the set more than delivered on the hype it promised, its limited format has left a more contentious legacy. The format's bomb rares are often considered problematic, though many of them can be dealt with by using the format's more effective than its typical removal, available at common and uncommon. The cycle of God Eternals, however, remain problematic, as it's incredibly hard to offer a permanent answer to them in Limited. The planeswalkers provided in every pack are an exciting and novel twist, and are arguably part of what keeps people cracking war packs to this day. They add an incredible amount of complexity to the set, with their overlapping effects and slowing the pace of the game. Whether this slow pace is a positive or negative thing, however, largely depends upon your own personal views about what makes a limited format fun. Finally, many of the set's draft archetypes were novel, and, at least in my opinion, fun to build. Even if proliferate decks didn't always go off in practice, and your amassed armies kept getting removed, the decks you built almost always had a central strategy in mind, which made them much more interesting to play than simply slamming together a selection of generic good cards. So War of the Spark may not be a limited format to everyone's tastes, but ultimately it was, if nothing else, a worthwhile experiment. With a long-running project like Magic the Gathering, which has been around for 27 years, a handful longer than I've been alive, being able to shake things up and explore new ways of designing sets is always important. Wizards of the Coast looks set to continue this sort of experimental design into the future. The upcoming Ikoria Lair of Behemoths is being marked as the set in which players build their own monsters, a new way of playing which I'm personally incredibly excited to try. Thanks for watching. Feedback's always appreciated, especially as this is a new channel and I'm still trying to figure out what sort of Magic the Gathering content I should create. Did you guys enjoy this video format, and would you like to see me dissect any more limited environments in the future? I'll see you next time.